Have you ever wondered what became of the MG42 gunners, who rained terror on the beaches of Normandy, mowing down thousands of Allied soldiers with their relentless fire? Today, we're diving into their stories, alongside lesser-known accounts from the largest amphibious assault in human history. Let's set the scene. The MG42 first appeared in 1942 and quickly earned its reputation as the German Army's go-to machine gun. It followed soldiers from the sands of North Africa to the frozen plains of the Eastern Front, eventually finding its place in almost every defensive stronghold. Its terrifying sound earned it nicknames like Hitler's buzzsaw, and its staggering rate of fire cemented it as a nightmare for anyone advancing under its gaze. But we're not here to rehash specs or nicknames. Instead, we want to understand what it meant to stand behind one of these guns, and ultimately what fate awaited the men who fired them on D-Day. German commanders were determined to stop the Allies before they even reached shore. They constructed fortified positions known as Widerstandsnester, or resistance nests along the coast. Each nest was carefully placed so that its field of fire overlapped with neighbouring positions, creating a deadly crossfire. On Omaha Beach alone, 15 of these strong points were strategically aligned to cover every inch of sand. Any soldier who survived one gun's line of fire would almost certainly run into another. A single MG42 was typically operated by a crew of 3: the gunner, an assistant to feed belts and swap overheated barrels, and a third man carrying extra ammunition. Many of these men had fought in previous campaigns, but by 1944, some positions were manned by inexperienced replacements, barely out of training. Regardless of experience, their mission was chillingly simple: fire until the beach was cleared, or die trying. Ironically, the same weapon that made them so deadly also marked them as prime targets. Allied planners meticulously mapped the coastline, identifying strong points and concealed gun positions hidden in bluffs. Every Widerstandsnest was numbered and catalogued. On paper, the plan was flawless. Naval bombardments and aerial strikes would obliterate defences, clearing the way for troops to secure the beaches. In reality, it was far messier. Dawn brought a thunderous artillery barrage as battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashed thousands of shells on known fortifications. Yet, reinforced concrete bunkers were not so easily destroyed. Many resistance nests survived largely intact, their MG42s still snapping fire as the landing ramps dropped. Inside those bunkers, German soldiers understood something monumental was underway. Every thunderous shell, every distant aircraft overhead, signaled that the largest amphibious assault in history had begun. And for the gunners, the fight for life and death was about to be absolute. When the German gunners finally looked out, the scene before them was staggering. Hundreds of Allied landing craft surged toward the beaches, a rolling tide of men and machines. While British and Canadian forces had the advantage of specialised Hobart's funnies, ingenious tanks designed to smash bunkers that survived the initial bombardment, the Americans faced a far harsher reality on Omaha Beach. Their armoured support was supposed to come from duplex drive tanks, yet disaster struck before they even touched the sand. Of the 32 tanks launched in the first wave, 27 sank beneath the waves. Only 5 reached the shore, and of those, a mere 3 were still operational. Even those 3 fell quickly under fire, leaving the machine gun nests free to wreak havoc. A scene of carnage that would echo in history for decades. The lethality of the MG42 crews wasn't just in the weapon itself, but in their deadly tactics. One notorious method was called mowing the grass. Instead of aiming for torsos, gunners fired low, cutting down soldiers' legs. The wounded drew medics and comrades to help them, creating even more targets for the relentless gunners. Other tricks were just as effective. One machine gun would fire tracer rounds high, giving the illusion of missed shots, while a hidden gun fired at the true killing zone. These simple yet cunning tactics struck fear into the hearts of men and often proved fatal. As the first waves struck the sand, all the well-laid plans dissolved under the chaos. Casualties mounted by the minute. Small groups of soldiers began moving forward on their own, using whatever cover they could find: tank traps, shell craters, even the bodies of the fallen. Allied training had emphasized exploiting the brief pauses of the MG42, moments needed for barrel changes or reloading, and officers shouted for troops to dash across open ground during those fleeting seconds. One daring sergeant took initiative with a small team and a bazooka to neutralize WN61, a fortified strongpoint sweeping the beach with gunfire. They first destroyed a 50mm anti-tank gun supporting the MG42s, then advanced to silence the machine gunners one by one. In a fierce close-quarters fight, they eliminated 7 defenders and destroyed 2 gun positions, suffering only a single casualty and 1 wounded. That single bold action eased pressure on that sector of the beach and opened a critical path inland. All across Omaha, however, the struggle continued. Rangers, engineers, and infantrymen crawled forward under ceaseless fire, inch by inch, trying to reach the deadly bunkers. At Dog White, Rangers stormed a strong point under the cover of smoke, silencing its guns. On Easy Red Sector, engineers cleared obstacles to allow troops to scale the bluffs and outflank the entrenched defenders. But even once a machine gun bunker was reached, the battle was far from over. The true fight, the violent, brutal seconds that determined life or death, happened after the soldiers were inside. When the assault teams finally closed in on an MG42 nest, the fight became brutal and immediate. Grenades and satchel charges tore through the concrete, silencing the guns while any surviving defenders were shot on the spot. Flamethrowers would follow, flushing smoke and fire into the bunkers, consuming the strong point and ensuring it could no longer pose a threat. As the beach was finally seized, some German gunners, wounded out of ammunition or simply exhausted, surrendered. But after witnessing the carnage they had wrought, adrenaline surging through every Allied soldier, not all offers of capitulation were welcomed. By early afternoon, the tide had unmistakably turned. US infantry and engineers clawed their way to the bluffs, systematically neutralizing or bypassing the remaining strongpoints. After-action reports from Omaha Beach credited the victory to the sheer relentless courage of those soldiers and engineers who had succeeded where pre-landing bombardments had largely failed. With the MG42s silenced, the transformation was immediate. Beach exits opened, allowing armour and reinforcements to surge inland. The German defensive line, previously anchored by those deadly nests, was now stripped of its most feared firepower. Isolated positions were linked, and the invasion advanced. MG42 crews continued to fight throughout Normandy's hedgerows, but never again in such concentrated positions, or with the chance to halt the Allied advance in a single decisive day. On June 6th, the MG42 had done all it could. The stories from that morning remain harrowing, forever etched in history. For the Allied infantry, facing an MG42 was sheer terror incarnate. Many of the men in the first wave were green, fresh from training, and had never been under real fire. Even before reaching the shore, the weapon's staccato rattle was unmistakable, a tearing, relentless roar that some likened to ripping canvas or a chainsaw gnawing through timber. Veterans later admitted that the sound alone could freeze blood, leaving soldiers motionless, trapped in a paralysis born of fear. When the landing craft ramps finally dropped, instinct screamed to hit the sand and stay down. One squad leader yelled at his men to keep moving if they wanted to survive, forcing them to overcome the hypnotic terror of bullets whistling across the open beach. Every soldier knew they were exposed, a sitting target under murderous fire. Army medic Ray Lambert recalled rounds slicing through the water, striking men still struggling in the surf. Some units barely made it ashore at all. At Dog Green sector, one company suffered nearly 90% casualties within minutes. Yet, amid the chaos, men kept pushing forward. Some because of orders, some from duty, and some simply because stopping meant dying where they fell. On the other side of the barrels, the perspective was just as harrowing. For the German gunners, the day began in darkness. On Strong Point, WN62, above Omaha Beach, 20-year-old Heinrich So awoke to alarms signaling the invasion had begun. A day that would etch itself into terror and history alike. By the first light of dawn, Heinrich So was at his prepared firing position, MG42 at the ready, staring out over the turbulent waters. What met his eyes was almost unreal. Hundreds of landing craft, thousands of men surging relentlessly toward his position. When the first waves of soldiers came into range, So unleashed hell. For the next 9 hours, he poured belt after belt into the onrushing troops, expending nearly 12,000 rounds. His assistant gunner had fallen early, leaving him alone at the gun, and all around him comrades were cut down one by one. So later described the experience as impossible. No matter how many he shot, more continued to come. By early afternoon, with his position collapsing and ammunition spent, he abandoned the gun and fled, scrambling through shell craters, broken hedgerows, and debris in a desperate bid to survive until nightfall. The following morning, surrounded by US troops, he surrendered, but cautiously concealed the fact that he had been one of the gunners responsible for so many deaths on the beach. Not all MG42 crews were so fortunate. Many perished in their bunkers, and those captured alive were often stunned to find themselves spared, given the ferocity of the assault and the number of casualties they had inflicted. For both sides, the day left deep, indelible scars. Allied veterans would forever remember the MG42's relentless roar, while German survivors recounted the faces and moments that haunted them long after the war. Neutralizing an MG42 position was never a textbook operation. It required advancing dangerously close, often mere meters from the target, all under the gunner's unrelenting fire. Every step forward was a gamble. One misstep could mean death before reaching the objective. And when the assault finally breached the bunker, the fight was brutal, swift, and often over in an instant. For the men behind the machine guns, this was the nightmare they had feared from the first alarm of the invasion. Once the Allies pressed through, gunners were trapped. The very firing ports that shielded them from frontal attacks now boxed them in. Options were grim. Hold until overrun, or attempt to surrender, neither offered comfort. MG42 crews were marked men. The devastation they wrought made them the most reviled targets on the battlefield, and many feared what would happen if the attackers reached them first. While most Allied soldiers followed the rules of the 1929 Geneva Convention, taking prisoners as required, there are accounts of captured gunners being executed on the spot by men who had just lost comrades to their fire. Professionalism was a fragile thing under the weight of grief and rage. Not every German gunner was a hardened Nazi or battle-tested veteran. Some were young conscripts from Eastern Europe, thrust into service and fighting more out of fear of their officers than loyalty to Hitler. Yet in those final moments, fear, duty and sheer survival intertwined, leaving every man on both sides haunted by the horrors of D-Day. In some cases, MG42 crews surrendered the moment they realized their position was hopeless. Others fought on, driven by desperation, duty, or the grim belief that surrender might be no safer than resistance. The psychological weight on these gunners was immense. Beneath the deafening roar of their own weapons, they could hear enemy boots pounding closer above them, the threat of grenades waiting to be thrown inside, the inevitability of the end pressing in. And when that end came, it was not always the relief they might have hoped for. On D-Day, the final desperate moments often blurred the line between survival and doom. In some rare and disturbing cases, being killed was almost merciful. Reports exist, though seldom documented, of captured MG42 crews facing brutal reprisals, a grim reflection of the fury and losses their guns had caused. These incidents were overshadowed by the overwhelming Allied victory that secured a new front in Europe and ultimately helped turn the tide of the war. For those gunners who survived, the memory of that morning never faded. Hinrich So, for instance, returned to a quiet farm and a town seemingly untouched by war, yet carried the invisible weight of the battlefield within him. So spoke little of Omaha Beach for decades, yet the memories lingered. Many years later, he reached out to families of fallen comrades and even met David Silver, a US veteran he had wounded that day. The two men, once locked in mortal combat, sat together, talking as human beings rather than enemies, a reconciliation that would have been unimaginable in 1944. For So, it was a fragile measure of peace. Other German veterans returned to ordinary lives, rarely mentioning the MG42 except in hushed conversations with fellow soldiers. To them, the weapon was both a badge of professional pride and a source of private guilt. To all who witnessed it in action, however, the MG42 remained unforgettable, a force of nature, a relentless fury etched into memory. In countless memoirs, the simple phrase, "the machine gun opened up," almost always meant the MG42. Its signature buzzsaw roar, immortalized in films like The Longest Day and Saving Private Ryan, continues to echo through history, while the bunkers of Normandy still stand as silent monuments to its power and the scars it left on all who faced it.